Queen Alara adjusted the crown that was slightly too large for her head, though she suspected the royal jeweler had intended that as a daily exercise in neck endurance. She swatted at a hovering tea drone that refused to stop circling her throne, muttering something about caffeine overexposure and robotic etiquette. "Honestly," she said aloud, ignoring the fact that half the court was watching her like she'd announced a new law banning gravity for cats. "If this thing spills tea on my robes again, it's going straight to the oubliette." The drone beeped in what she could only assume was robotic defiance, and veered slightly too close to the tapestry, depicting her great-grandmother riding a space whale. Alara sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose, her unusually long ears twitching in irritation, a trait she inherited from a Viridian line famed for diplomatic arguments and overly expressive auditory appendages. The day had started like any other, with the council debating the proper taxation of asteroid miners who insisted their only currency was rare laughter crystals. The ministers were squabbling over definitions of fairness, in a way that made Alara question whether she should just declare the moon a neutral zone and be done with it. Then came the voice. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, like someone had accidentally set a whisper on a frequency only she could hear. "Alara." The sound curled around her mind, gentle yet impossibly precise, carrying a weight that made her pulse jitter as if she'd just sipped 5 cups of ultra-caffeine tea brewed from hyperluminescent leaves. She froze mid-gesture, pointing at the offending tea drone as if to blame it for the cosmic disturbance she suddenly felt. The council murmured behind her, though she ignored them. She had never heard that name before, not spoken aloud, not written in any record, not whispered in the archives stacked from floor to ceiling behind the throne. And yet it resonated in her bones, making her twitchy ears hum with a strange energy she could not name. Curiosity won over protocol, as it usually did when her instincts involved mysterious strangers. She followed the sound, leaving the drone to circle aimlessly around her golden footstool like a very caffeinated mosquito. It led her down a series of corridors that smelled faintly of ionized metal and burnt caramel, a combination she would later insist was the fragrance of destiny. At the end of the corridor, a figure waited, leaning casually against a wall that shimmered as if the material itself had decided to consider retirement. The man looked human at first glance, which was part of the problem, because in a universe where humans were a rarity, it was hard to tell whether someone human was trustworthy or secretly a holographic prank designed to steal your coffee. His hair fell in awkward, gravity-defying waves, and his eyes glinted with starlight, or perhaps that was just the reflection of a maintenance bot polishing the floors behind him. "You've returned," he said, which struck Alara as both polite and eerily accusatory. "Though I suppose returned is a generous term, considering you've never been here." He smiled, and the corners of his mouth tilted in a way that suggested he had memorized every secret joke the universe had ever told, but had decided to share only with himself. Alara raised an eyebrow, long ear twitching. "Do I know you?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be complicated, inconvenient, and possibly involve interdimensional paperwork. "I could answer that," he said, stepping closer, "but it might destroy your sense of reality, or at least your afternoon plans." He held out a hand which she did not shake, because she had the distinct feeling that shaking it might accidentally trigger some cosmic chain reaction involving hyperquantum particles she did not understand, and did not want to deal with before her 3rd cup of tea. The air between them thrummed, low and rhythmic, like a city breathing through giant, invisible lungs. Alara felt her own pulse sync with it, a strange and slightly alarming sensation that made her toes curl inside her boots. The man tilted his head, studying her, and she realized with sudden clarity that he wasn't just human. He was a walking anomaly, a puzzle wrapped in starlight, and he had somehow found her. "Why am I hearing my name?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual, as though asking such questions in a royal corridor wasn't inherently dramatic. "Is this some kind of court trick? Did the archivist finally learn holographic ventriloquism?" He chuckled, and the sound bounced against the walls with a soft, almost musical resonance. "Not a trick, not a ventriloquist. Something older than your archives, older than the crown you wear, something that chose you." Alara blinked. Her ears twitched nervously. "Chose me? I can barely choose the right socks in the morning, let alone the fate of a universe." He shrugged, grin widening. "Fate has a sense of humor." For the first time in years, Alara laughed, a short, sharp sound that made the tea drone spin in excitement. "Well, fate," she said, smoothing her robes with exaggerated patience, If you're going to involve me in something cosmic, at least give me a manual. Preferably one with pictures. The man's smile softened, and he inclined his head. No manual, just me and the name you now carry, and if you're very lucky, a little chaos. Alara's long ears twitched again, this time with something that felt like anticipation. She had no idea what she was stepping into, and somehow that made the world feel brighter, funnier, and infinitely more dangerous. She took a deep breath, knowing that whatever came next, her life, and possibly the galaxy, would never be the same. Alara followed the man, Kal, he finally admitted, though he insisted on pronouncing it differently depending on the gravity of the planet, through a winding network of tunnels beneath the palace. The walls hummed with faint pulses of energy, which made her ears vibrate like fine-tuned antennas. "You know," she said, tapping one long ear with a gloved finger, "I usually have at least a week's warning before my life turns into a cosmic adventure. Could you give me a heads-up next time?" Kal smirked, floating slightly above the ground with a convenience gravity device that seemed to defy both logic and municipal safety regulations. "Where's the fun in that?" he asked. "Besides, a week is plenty of time to overthink everything. Trust me, I've seen what happens when rulers overthink. It's not pretty, usually involves exploding muffins and an interstellar lawsuit." Alara raised an eyebrow. "Exploding muffins? You'd be surprised." He flicked a hand and a holographic muffin appeared midair, spinning and releasing a faint puff of smoke. "See, harmless demonstration, mostly." Alara snorted, though her fingers tingled in the way she had begun to notice whenever Kal's presence, or perhaps his name, was near. "Mostly harmless," she repeated. "I feel safer already." They emerged from the tunnels into a hangar, so vast it could have swallowed her entire throne room without anyone noticing. The ship waiting there looked absurdly cheerful for a vessel that could cross star systems in hours. It was teapot-shaped, glossy with panels that gleamed as if each surface had been buffed by the laughter of 1,000 asteroids. Hover engines hissed like they were gossiping, and the main console had a small sign reading, "Do not feed the flux capacitor after midnight asterisk." Alara blinked. "This is your ship." Kal grinned. "Yes, the modest adventurer asterisk, and no, it doesn't actually taste like tea. I've tested it extensively, once. Once was enough," he said, waving a hand mysteriously. "Also, it's sentient, it likes jokes, mostly bad ones, you might fit in perfectly." Alara stepped inside, brushing her hands over the controls with a mixture of curiosity and mild panic. "I don't even know how to fly this thing." "Flying," Kal said, "is mostly about waving your hands dramatically and occasionally threatening to launch a decoy asteroid. The rest is intuition and luck." As they lifted off, leaving the palace hovering as if someone had pressed snooze on reality, the stars stretched into streaks. Alara's hair floated behind her and her ears twitched uncontrollably. "I have to admit," she said, "this is more fun than the council ever let me have." Kal leaned back, adjusting a panel that seemed to respond to his thoughts rather than touch. "Fun is relative, especially when your queenly responsibilities include not accidentally detonating other planets." "You make it sound casual," she said, "like detonations happen every Thursday." "Only every other Thursday," Kal replied with perfect seriousness. "The other Thursdays are reserved for political misunderstandings and zero-gravity custard fights." Alara shook her head, laughing despite herself. The absurdity of it all, her long ears quivering with energy, the impossibly smug alien, a ship that looked like it belonged in a children's story, made her pulse race. But beneath the humor, a thread of purpose tugged at her, insistent and rhythmic, like the beat of some distant, mechanical heart. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the Nexus," Kal said. "A place where time is optional and rules are mostly suggestions, also where your powers will make slightly more sense. Don't worry, there's coffee. Synthetic, of course, but highly caffeinated." As they passed through a cloud of ionized particles that glittered like scattered diamonds, Alara's hands tingled again. This time, she tried focusing, letting the energy flow through her long ears, her fingertips, even her boots. The feeling was electric and warm, like the universe itself was giving her a high five. And then, just as suddenly, the ship's sensors flashed a warning, proximity alert, rogue asteroid disguised as giant space turtle. Alara squeaked, Kal grinned. "Relax, I've seen worse. Once a rogue asteroid disguised itself as a space whale wearing a tutu. It was memorable." She tried to relax, mostly failing. The rogue asteroid tumbled dangerously close. but the ship's systems reacted faster than her brain could process. Lights blinked, alarms buzzed, and the teapot-shaped vessel twisted in space like a ballerina who had discovered anti-gravity. Through it all, Call hummed a little tune and pressed buttons that glowed in indecipherable sequences. By the time the danger passed, Elara was laughing so hard she nearly fell off her seat. "You call that training?" "Exactly," Call said, bowing slightly. "Also, consider it a personality test. You passed, obviously, barely, but passed." The tension that had clawed at her chest since hearing her name softened, replaced by a strange exhilaration. She realized that her powers, unpredictable and thrilling, were not just something she had to fear. They were something she could play with, something that made her feel alive in a way that royal duties had never managed. And as the stars stretched into streaks around them, she finally felt ready, even eager, for the adventures that lay ahead, with a smirk tugging at her lips and ears twitching in anticipation. Elara hovered at the edge of the platform, ears twitching in nervous anticipation, as the council's emissaries argued behind her about whether the floating holographic dais should be rotated 90 degrees for optimal diplomacy. "Honestly," she muttered, "if they spent half as much time thinking about actual threats as they do about dais angles, we might be a little safer." Call leaned against the railing with the same casual confidence that had gotten him through asteroid attacks, zero-gravity custard fights, and rogue space turtles, and he grinned at her. "Relax, dais angles are negotiable. Rogue assassins less so." She shot him a look, her long ears quivering. "You've been awfully calm about everything." "Years of practice," he said. "Also, I have the advantage of not being responsible for planetary taxation. You, on the other hand, should probably take a deep breath and maybe practice a menacing glare. Works wonders." Elara took a deep breath. She could feel the energy in her veins, the resonance of her name still echoing like a gentle drumbeat in her mind. The whispers that had first drawn her to Call had become a steady hum, a pulse she could command, a force she could channel. She raised her hand, and the energy coalesced into shimmering arcs above the dais, bending and weaving around her with a grace that even she found a little unnerving. The cabal that had been plotting to destabilize the fragile alliance between her world and Call's had arrived in force, thinking the queen unprepared. They wore the uniforms of bureaucratic overlords, but their eyes betrayed greed and panic. Elara, however, was no longer the cautious ruler who had needed a week's warning for cosmic adventures. She smiled, letting her energy ripple outward, causing their communication devices to hum and sputter in a chaotic, very confusing manner. A few holographic displays flickered, showing images of kittens in space helmets instead of attack vectors. The emissaries sputtered. Call stepped closer. "Optional suggestion, now might be a good time for one of your famous looks of regal fury, or at least something between mild annoyance and glacial disapproval." Elara tilted her head, ears flicking dramatically. "Glacial disapproval, you say? Excellent." She directed the energy toward the cabal's tech, the flickering arcs weaving around the intruders' devices, rendering them harmless but spectacularly confused. Holographic kittens multiplied and bounced around the dais, their tiny space helmets wobbling precariously. The cabal's leader blinked. "What is happening?" "It's called Style Darling," Elara said, letting her energy settle into a shimmering crown of light around her head. "And a little magic courtesy of cosmic fate and Call's terrible puns." Call grinned. "I like to think of it as team building." The cabal, flustered and defeated by the absurdity of their own high-tech devices, finally surrendered, mumbling complaints about interstellar decor violations and unprofessional holographic kittens. Elara allowed herself a small, victorious smile. She realized she had grown, not just in power but in confidence. Where she had once doubted herself, she now knew she could command energy, influence events, and even bend the occasional interstellar law without toppling the universe. After the emissaries had been escorted away, none worse for wear, though perhaps mildly embarrassed, Elara turned to Call. "I suppose we should discuss the formalities of alliance and treaty signatures now." Call nodded, leaning back with one foot dangling over the platform edge. "Sure, but first, a suggestion, celebratory tea." "You're impossible," she said, though she laughed, ears twitching with amusement. "But yes, tea." They walked together back to the ship, which had somehow grown more cheerful after the day's events. Even the flux capacitor gave a faint, approving hum, as if acknowledging that all was well. The stars outside stretched in streaks of light as the ship lifted, carrying them away from political chaos and toward the quiet satisfaction of accomplishment. "Do you ever get tired of all this?" Alara asked. "Of cosmic threats, rogue asteroids, and interdimensional paperwork?" Call shrugged. "Sometimes, but then you find someone who can actually handle it, who laughs at kittens in space helmets, and suddenly it's manageable. Fun, even." Alara's ears twitched, and she felt the familiar pulse of energy rise warmly through her. She had learned to control it, to trust it, and most importantly, to trust herself. She glanced at Call and realized that, against the odds, they had formed a partnership that was more than alliance. It was understanding, trust, and occasionally well-timed sarcasm. As the asterisk modest adventure jumped into faster-than-light travel, leaving streaks of stars behind like glitter scattered across the void, Alara leaned back and allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. The queen who had once been cautious, hesitant, and doubtful was gone, replaced by someone who could laugh in the face of cosmic absurdity and still command the universe's hidden forces. Call looked over, smiling. "Next adventure." Alara tilted her head, ears flicking. "Next adventure, but first tea and maybe more kittens." The ship sailed forward into the glittering expanse of stars, carrying the queen, the alien, and the universe's faintly ridiculous, infinitely beautiful sense of humor along with them. And for the first time in her life, Alara felt that everything, danger, laughter, power, and the unexpected, was exactly where it was meant to be. The adventure had ended, but the journey, with all its lessons, jokes, and cosmic wonders, had only just begun.